Hi and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and here's my question for today. What can we learn and what new perspective can we gain from reflecting? Today, you will be hearing part one of the last conversation for season 2 for 2023, and it's a very special one because I am the subject of it, actually. And what we're going to do today is spend some time reflecting on this past year and the things that I feel like I have learned or I am learning. And I'll get to share a little bit about my own life. In this conversation, I am joined by Marit, who has been very, very important to this podcast behind the scenes. She was one of the people that I collaborated with very early on and has been a great mentor to me throughout the past 2 seasons and 2 years of this podcast. I was honored that she was willing to interview me. Okay, so let's jump in with Marit and myself.
Hi, Abbie.
Hi.
It's so great to see you.
It's great to see you, Marit.
I've really been looking forward to this.
Me too.
And I feel quite excited about the conversation we're about to have.
I feel quite excited and quite nervous. It's very different to be on this end of the conversation, to be asked the questions instead of doing the asking.
I can imagine. Yeah, I could dive off with a lot of questions just starting there, right. About control and stuff like that. But I thought I'd, because this is a real role reversal. It's me interviewing you rather than you interviewing somebody else. And you wanted to talk about season 2.
Mm-hmm.
I want to start with the question that you have started to start with.
Yes.
In the last part of your year as well, about making better social worlds and what that looks like for you. So I have a really curious question for you before we go directly to that. And that is, if you were to describe a piece of art that would represent this journey that you've done over this last year, and how do you view making better social worlds and what that means? And what would that piece of art look like, feel like, sound like? What shapes could it have? What sort of sensational?
Yeah. The very first place I feel like I have to start is that it would have texture.
Right.
And that kind of reflects why it works to ask the same question every episode, and that it's not going to lead to the same conversation. There's so much texture to that question. And sometimes when I ask it, people kind of laugh or shake their heads and say, that's, where do I even start? That's such a ridiculous question to ask. That's huge to try to think about, what I as one person want for the world. But then every time they have an answer, regardless of how complete or not it feels to them, maybe. There's a lot of texture.
What is it, rough or smooth or?
If the texture reflects the vast variety of responses that I've heard to that question, then it's got to be a little bit of both. I'm thinking about how if you were to paint something or create a piece of art, that there's a temptation to keep going back. Maybe you look at it and you think, oh, that's really beautiful. But then you're like, oh, if I just do a little bit more, then I'll fix it. And then maybe you get to a point where you're like, oh no, I've ruined it. I think that that's not possible with this piece of art. This feels like this is the piece of art it's never going to hang in a museum or in your house. Right. It's just sitting on the easel, and you are actually going to keep coming back to it and paint your whole life.
Right. Wow.
So there's a lot of layers.
Yeah. And there's added as time goes.
Mm-hmm. So if there ever was a, end product then there'd be a lot of layers under it that you wouldn't see. But if you are the person to have painted it, then you'd know that they're there,
Right.
contributing to that texture. And yeah.
A beautiful picture. That says a lot about life, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what we keep doing as well, adding layers and texture and color.
Yep.
And does it have any sound?
I don't know. I don't know.
What about you say texture? What about smell or other kind of sensations?
I'm stuck between. Part of me wants to say, oh, that the colors are pastels and they're gentle on the eyes and easy to look at, and oh, the smells are so pleasant. And because I want to reflect that what we hope for our better social world is the kind of feeling that pleasant colors and pleasant smells could create in you, a sense of calm and hope and peace. But also that doesn't feel entirely right, because in a lot of my conversations, we acknowledge that the road to that better social world is not necessarily easy, or we'd already be there. But I don't think it smells bad.
Well, it could even smell bad sometimes.
Right,
some of the layers, maybe, who knows?
True.
Actually, some of those layers can be really stinky, can't they?
Right. That's at the risk of sounding like this is a cop-out answer. It's just everything. It smells bad. It smells good. It looks good. It looks bad, which is a false binary anyway. But it's messy, and it is a little bit of everything in my mind. This picture that has been painted about all of our collective ideas of what a better social world looks like.
Fascinating. So if you know where to start with your own story of how your own view of making better social worlds have been affected by the stories that you've been collecting, or having the conversations that you've been having over this last year, this season 2, have your own definition changed on what better social worlds might look or feel or taste or smell or...
Yeah, it has.
Say more.
I've had lots of conversations, and maybe just because of recency, the one that feels pretty big was my most recent conversation with Rami. The way she talked about better social worlds felt like an aha moment for me, in that I was kind of using this future language of what would a better social world in the future look like to you.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, there is no future. There's only the present. The future is this idea that's in our head. It's a construct of language, but it's always only the present. And so that just really changed my thinking about the way I ask and the way I understand what a better social world looks like, because in my mind, and when I'm asking that question, it is always kind of something that's further down the road. And I'm asking my guests, what is that better social world? As in, what's that far off thing? And then we kind of, talk more about how we would get there. But it changes how I think of it to say, the better social world could be and is right now. And how do we make it so right now? So that kind of changed my relationship to how I ask the question, or how I'm understanding the question. And so we got back to this idea of a better social world is one where we're trying to make a better social world. And there's lots of parameters that I could put around how I would define a better social world, like there being more peace and more justice and more equity. And also, it's the creation of those things that creates the better social world in and of itself. I think as we're the striving for those things is what makes us better and makes our world better, is kind of what I've taken away from a lot of my conversations. And again, I feel more comfortable than a past version of Abbie would have felt with that kind of inception answer. Because I'm trying to ask I think ask more questions than give answers is something that's kind of come about for me this year. And that's reflected in even the introduction to my episodes that I used to say, here's what I know, which is a ridiculous thing to say, first of all.
Can I just stop you there?
Yeah.
Did you hear what you just said?
Which part?
The ridiculous part. Does it have to be ridiculous, Abbie?
What I would call the both and of this moment is that, well, funny you say that because yes. So there's a part of me and a part of my life where what I'm working on is knowing things. And that's specifically knowing myself, being in touch with what I want and what I need and standing up for those things and really embracing my own knowing. And at the same time, in the podcast specifically, I'm on a journey of knowing less. And so that's the part of me that says it's ridiculous to think I could know anything. And so there is, as I say that, there is a full other part of me that is really developing and knowing and really wants to do that and is working on thinking it's not ridiculous that I could know something. So I contain multitudes in that way, as we all do. But that's the part of me that's saying it's ridiculous to know anything, is that I was coming at the podcast and what I thought I could offer people as I need to know things and then tell it to them. And that is how they will gain value from this. But what is more true in the context of the podcast is that if I can be asking questions and learning alongside, then I think that's infinitely more valuable and more true, because as I enter into conversation with so many different people and their stories that I don't know, I have to come in with a curious stance rather than a I already know everything stance.
So I hear there's been a huge development from that first podcast with Stephanie. Yes.
Yeah.
And the conversations you were having then and the conversation that you are now referring to that you've just had with Romy. There's been a kind of a meeting of worlds and a crossing of worlds.
Yeah.
In what becomes more important and what becomes less important in a given context. Does that make sense? Is that, am I hearing you right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's just everything keeps becoming more complex in the sense that there are layers and layers and layers that I keep finding or peeling back, or I'm starting to explore in ways that I wasn't before. So that's where I'm thankful, because I'm thankful to have CMM, because that helps me feel, having that as a lens helps me feel like I can navigate those layers and that complexity a little easier.
Say more about that.
I don't feel so overwhelmed by the fact that there is complexity, because I feel like I have some tools to help me navigate it.
And what are those tools and how do they help you navigate?
The first tool is just to have the language, because it's not always something I had, so I don't take it for granted. I grew up thinking that the world was very simple. And so it was a shock to my system when I started to have experiences and meet people and see things that I couldn't easily fit into good and bad categories. And so I started to become aware of the gray. But I think for people that have maybe had experiences like that, your instinct might be to ignore the gray and continue to try to fit things into a good and bad box, try to make things simple because you don't know how to navigate complexity, because that wasn't taught or modeled. But about the time that I was in college and started kind of developing this sense that the world was more complex than I thought it was also when I started studying communication and learning about theories like CMM and gaining this language for understanding all of the intricacies and the nuance of human relationships and the way we are in the world. And so from CMM specifically, just the idea that we make meaning was revolutionary to me.
Oh.
Along with the simple view of the world that I had when I was looking at those good and bad boxes, there was not any questioning of, and who decided what was good and who decided what was bad? How did that good and bad get made? It was just that that was what it was. So now it's curiosity. It's having an understanding and seeing myself as someone who makes meaning, seeing other people as meaning makers. That in and of itself is a tool that I feel like I have in my toolbox, to that when things get complex and tricky and messy and simple Abbie feels really overwhelmed, then I kind of lean on that language and that understanding. It's like if the two layers of what's challenging about complexity is one, admitting that it is complex because you could just ignore it. I guess that's not the way I want to say that. It's more, sometimes I have a sense when things are complex that it shouldn't be. Like maybe we spend some time.
Something is ridiculous. Something is just ridiculous. And that's how it is.
Yeah. Or you spend some time just like, if only this was simple. If only there was a way to make this not complex. But having the language of CMM and other communication theories helps me to, I think, just spend less time in that part, spend less time trying to deny the complexity because I think it shouldn't be there because I wish it wasn't there, and just go straight to embracing it, which means that I can get, not that that's easy, that makes it sound really easy, but kind of go straight to asking questions of the complexity and showing up to it and being in relationship with it maybe, and being in relationship with the people in that complexity.
You had such a variety of conversations over this last year, and some of them, I imagine, have been more challenging and more complex than others. Is there an example you could, or do you want to use an example, or do you want just to sort of generalize more in terms of what that was like for you, and how you really got to, you were tweaked and pulled and pushed, and you know it hurt kind of.
Yeah. I think to speak less about a specific conversation and more about a couple of conversations in relationship to each other is that one of the challenges this year, especially as I had, twice as many conversations as I recorded the past year, talked to so many more people about so many more topics. The challenge was learning to meet people where they're at, learning to meet my guests where they're at, because in my head, I balance, the part of me that's, I really want to make a great podcast. And what are the things that I think goes into that? And I want to be a good conversation partner. And I know that I'm kind of the one that's leading us through this conversation by nature of it being my podcast and being the one that's asking the questions. Every single person I talk to shows up differently. And so the challenge for me is to, in those first couple of minutes or throughout the course of the conversation, kind of learn how to meet them where they're at. In terms of, like, I will say in my very first conversation with Stephanie, she brought so much energy. And so that made me feel energetic, and I kind of mirrored her in that way. She was so excited about what she was talking about. That made me excited. And then when I listened back, I thought, wow, we talked really fast. And we were just in that moment together. Other conversations I've had, and I'm trying to read people's face on Zoom. Like, I don't know what they're thinking. Are they having fun? Are they enjoying this? And then at the end, they're like, that was amazing. And I'm like, well, I wasn't sure that you were thinking that up until you just said it, because I couldn't tell on your face or in your body language or in the way that you were speaking, because I was maybe comparing you to someone like a Stephanie who was bringing a different energy. And so it's really seeing just people's different ways of being. And neither is right or wrong or good or bad. Again, it's not that simple, but it's just about how do I adjust? How do I be flexible to be able to have a really meaningful conversation with people who show up in different ways?
And I know that one of the things that you are working with for yourself is not being so judgmental on yourself as well.
Yeah.
Never mind other people. So in terms of how are you feeling in terms of how you're getting on with learning or being more present, being more open, being more, how's the internal conversation going on that part?
Yeah. The thing I think I don't want to admit is that I am in a lot of ways still guided by a kind of perfectionism. And I used to feel more aware of that in my life and how, again, because my world was simple, I was always, what do I need to do to be good? What do I need to do to be right? What do I need to achieve or create that is perfect?
No less.
No less. Yes. Yeah. I was holding myself to a very high standard.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Which again is not to say that anything I ever produced was exactly perfect, but I had this sense in my head that it could be.
Right.
And that's what mattered. And that's what guided me. And I don't feel that so much anymore, but I think I have to be honest that there is some of it left in me. But the podcast has been a kind of masterclass or sped up version of kind of unlearning perfectionism, because I've said I'm going to publish a podcast every week. And so regardless of whether I think it's exactly perfect or not, I'm putting something out into the world.
You don't have time to
right.
fret about it. You just have to do it.
I literally cannot make every episode quote unquote perfect, because that I don't have the time, and I don't what would I even do to make it perfect is its own question. But I've just started putting things out there, and it's all okay, and I'm okay, and meaningful things are being said, and people are hopefully taking value from it. And so that's been where I've maybe given myself a little more grace. And that's been the biggest teacher to myself, to say, hey, look, you did something that maybe you wouldn't consider perfect, but it's enough, and it's out there, and it's meaningful.
Wow. Makes me, I feel really touched by what you're sharing with me. I know how much hard work that is.
Yeah.
It really is hard work. And I remember, I think in one of your episodes, you said that you felt like you were straddling this gap between who you'd been and who you are becoming.
Yeah.
And in that straddling, I mean, not all of us are what you call gymnasts.
Yes.
We're not very good at making the split or whatever. It does actually hurt, it hurts to stand there. It hurts and to find the new balance point, to balance in a different way.
Yes.
And to find new positions, to create beauty and grace and openness and
Yeah.
And that's what you've been working at. And I imagine there has been some real growing pains. Would you be willing to share some of those growing pains with us?
Yeah, growing pains is the right word. The right words. That's it, honestly, before you even ask that question, that's how I've been thinking about it.
Right.
And that's what kind of keeps me hopeful, or keeps me staying curious in the face of some of the things that have pushed me to change or grow in the past year, is that I can be curious about them because they will help me grow. And I'm not always seeing that in the moment. That's usually more, upon reflection, I guess I appreciate whatever. I don't really like the, everything happens for a reason, or trying to bright side in the moment of something that is really a struggle. I just, want to give it the space to be what it is and let myself feel the emotions I feel. Those kinds of things feel like it kind of covers that up in a untrue way. But upon reflection, I think there is a little more room then for perspective and seeing the way that hard things can shape you. And so I'm not just sitting there saying I'm having pains right now. I am saying I'm having growing pains because I see that that's what's going on, which I'm thankful for. And I have had a moment recently. I have the privilege of going to therapy regularly, and was sitting in there talking about something the other day, and it wasn't fun to go through. But on the other side of it, sitting in front of my therapist, I was able to say, oh, all this work that we've been doing, all the times I've come and sitting here, like, it has been building towards something, because I have reacted differently than I would have a year or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. It was a good moment where I could kind of zoom out and say, oh, I have grown. Because in the moment, day to day, it's, I think, hard to have that perspective, for me at least.
Sure.
But in that moment, I was able to zoom out and say, oh, look, I have been growing. And there's evidence of it right here, because I just handled that situation differently than I would have before. And I know things about myself more.
How did that make you feel?
Hopeful. It wasn't the feeling of, like you said, the framing of your question is like, I'm not quite who I used to be, but I'm not quite who I'm becoming. This is not to say that I'm there, but it makes me feel hopeful for the rest of the process, and to recognize there's not really an end. I'll always be becoming, but it makes me hopeful for the rest of my becoming, that I can do it. I don't know that I can handle it, that I can do my best to stay present to it and be true to myself.
Well, what it sounds to me like is that you've actually made some very hard choices as well. You do give yourself time to reflect, for example.
Yeah.
Unless you actually take the time, as you said, in the day-to-day running of life.
Yeah.
It's hard to have those reflections, but you have to take time out. You have to make space for those growing pains to be reflected upon, and to notice that there, in fact, now is a difference. And maybe at this moment in time, I'm straddling a little bit less, I can actually put my feet a bit more back together, and the gap is not so huge as it used to be. Yes. And there will be new huge gaps, no doubt.
Yep.
And they will occur throughout life, hopefully, because otherwise I think that is life. That is part of life. And that's part of what we're called to do as well, is to be in that process of becoming. And having said that, we are as well at the same time, right now, right here.
Right.
And we are all those ambiguities and paradoxes and dilemmas and straddlings, and not leaving, but integrating parts of ourselves and emerging into new parts of ourselves, or expanding our own field of action, field of ability to respond rather than just react to situations. So I think that's what you're describing that sounds like you're describing to me, that you were able to respond. You didn't just have a knee-jerk reaction. You could sit in your therapy with your therapist and say, look, I actually responded. I did it differently. I didn't just react on that situation as I would have done before.
Yep. Which is something I talked about with Jennifer Furlong. We talked about reacting and responding.
Yes.
And so there are a lot of conversations I have that amazingly reinforce the things that are going on in my life outside of the podcast. And a lot of them do, happen to come at the time that I need to hear them. And I keep them in my back pocket as I, leave the conversation and try to keep using them. And yeah, just be reminded of all the things that I learn by hosting the podcast. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
As someone who's lived more life than me, what is it like to hear a 24-year-old talk about the things that she thinks she knows or has learned?
Oh my, it makes me feel so humble, Abbie. Makes me feel so grateful and hopeful and joyful to hear the journey that you're undertaking and that you're willing to share it with me and with people. I'm really touched. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marit. That's very sweet. I think with my, I want to know things.
Sure.
And so again, still in the process of becoming someone that's more comfortable asking questions and not knowing things. But there's a part of me that what I would call imposter syndrome happens to me sometimes, especially when I get to interact with, you and everyone else from the CMM Institute who I love and adore and have shown me nothing but kindness and respect. There's an imposter syndrome almost of like, what do I know? Like, I just want to learn everything that you all know. And so to sit here and talk about the things that I think that I know does make me feel like a little bit of an imposter and wondering if, you're sitting over there being like, oh, just you wait. You haven't seen anything yet.
Oh, doesn't exist in my world.
I didn't think so. Not from you, Marit, but there's like in me,
Yes, I know.
As I think about
and
the context that I'm speaking into and
sure.
Yeah, how much more life there is to learn and things to
and the
things
culture
to
in which we live as well. And
right.
and so many people might have reacted like that. So many people who are still in that dualistic either or kind of being in the world.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I think what you so beautifully share with us is this journey from that either or being in the world to that complexity being in the world and the layers being in the world and the expanding being in the world and the integrating being in the world and the making hard choices being in the world, allowing for growing pains, acknowledging them and owning them and letting them take the time they need to move into the next level of existence.
Yes.
Which is brings me right back to the painting that you painted for us at the beginning, right? So, where with all these layers of paint and of odors and colors and textures and beautiful image, and you are describing it in different ways. Mm-hmm. And you're doing it so eloquently and I really feel humble and honored.
That's very kind of you. I promise I wasn't just fishing for a compliment in those kind words asking
I
that.
Know you went.
I appreciate you, Marit. Okay, that is all for part 1 of this conversation with me and Marit. You can join next week for part 2, which will be the final episode of season 2. I know this is the part where I would usually offer you some questions for reflection, but seeing as how this whole episode has been my reflection, I'll invite you to take this time instead to think of your own questions. Maybe after listening to this conversation, some questions are coming up for you. So can you take a moment and pause and give yourself some space to linger on those questions, figure out what they are, and just let them stay with you. What kind of reflections is this conversation bringing up for you on this past year for yourself? I love the word season for a podcast and for myself because it feels true that we go through seasons. So maybe your season doesn't align exactly with my podcast season too. But what has this last season been like for you? Whatever that means for you, how would you reflect on it? As always, I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is one of many initiatives designed to help us walk closer to that better social world, which is always our goal. As far as podcast next turns, please share this conversation with someone you'd like to invite into this space with us to do some reflecting. Another great way to keep this conversation alive after the episode ends is to reach out to me. I am always available and always love to hear your thoughts, ideas, or questions that you have. And you can contact me through email, through the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. You can find links to all those places in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.